Chapter 21. The Triumph of Christianity and its Relations to Judaism. A turning point in world history unfolded during the period from 320 to 375 of the Common Era, when Christianity rose from a persecuted minority religion within the Roman Empire to the position of an officially supported and dominant state religion. This transformation marked not only a decisive crisis in the broader history of nations, but also a major turning point in Jewish history. For centuries before this moment, religious movements and philosophical ideas had been developing gradually and often invisibly, like a harvest slowly ripening. Christianity, despite repeated persecution by Roman authorities, continued to expand and strengthen. Over time, it gained influence even among its former opponents, eventually drawing segments of Roman society and leadership into its structure. The Roman Empire itself, which had long been the political and military center of the ancient world, increasingly aligned its authority with the Christian Church, allowing religious leadership to gain political power alongside imperial rule. At the same time, the older pagan religious system of the Greco-Roman world, often referred to as heathenism, which had been associated with traditional Roman and classical beliefs, began to decline. It was increasingly criticized for moral inconsistency and internal contradictions, and it gradually lost its position as the dominant cultural framework of the empire. Christianity, in contrast, presented itself with a structured moral system and a strong theological vision centered on a unified concept of God and ethical behavior. However, according to the historical description, its practical implementation did not always align fully with its theoretical ideals. Nevertheless, its institutional strength allowed it to replace earlier religious systems and become the defining ideological structure of the empire. As the political and cultural center of the Roman world shifted, so too did the status of older religious and intellectual centers. Rome and the regions of Italy, once the heart of imperial power, experienced a gradual decline in influence. In parallel, Judea and the city of Tiberias, which had taken over symbolic importance after the destruction of Jerusalem, also lost their former prominence. Under the new Christian political order, Judea experienced economic and intellectual weakening, and the scholarly institutions centered in Tiberias began to lose their former authority and attraction. Within Jewish intellectual life, Babylonia rose in importance during this period. Over approximately 50 years, it became a leading center of Jewish learning through the work of prominent Babylonian scholars such as Rabbah, Abai, and Rabbah, who developed and expanded the system of Talmudic analysis. In contrast, the scholars of Judea during this same period were fewer in number and less influential. Among the limited group of recognized Judean figures were Shagai, respected mainly for his age and experience, Jonah II, and Hosea, who were students and successors of earlier teachers Ami and Asi. The most significant authority in Judea at this time was Jeremiah, who was originally from Babylonia. However, his earlier lack of recognition in his homeland, where he had even been dismissed from the schools, highlights the shift in scholarly prestige from Judea to Babylonia. The institution of the Patriarchate, which had once been the central leadership office of the Jewish people in Roman territories, also entered a period of decline. Hillel II, a descendant of the earlier great leader Hillel, held this office during this time. In contrast to his predecessors, he is described as having voluntarily reduced the authority of his position. While the office of the Patriarch lost real political and religious influence within Judea, it simultaneously gained external ceremonial prestige in the wider Roman world. During its final century, the patriarchs were given high imperial titles such as illustrious, honorable, and distinguished, placing them nominally alongside senior Roman officials. Imperial legislation even declared severe punishment for anyone who publicly insulted the patriarchal office, demonstrating its formal recognition despite its declining internal power. During this era, the Roman Emperor Constantine played a central role in reshaping religious and political structures. He strengthened the position of Christianity within the empire, granting it authority and support that allowed it to expand rapidly. At the same time, he initially maintained a policy of religious tolerance, issuing early decrees that allowed all subjects of the empire, including Jews, to practice their religions freely. Under these early policies, Jewish religious leaders, including patriarchs, elders, and heads of academies and synagogues, were granted legal recognition similar to that of Christian clergy and pagan priests. However, this balance did not remain stable. As Christian influence increased within the imperial court, attitudes toward other religions became more restrictive. The new religious establishment began to favor Christian dominance, and tolerance gradually gave way to exclusionary policies. Within this shifting environment, the Patriarch of Judea was still formally recognized as the representative leader of the Jewish population across the Roman Empire, modeled in part on Roman and Christian administrative structures. Yet this recognition increasingly lacked real political strength. Christian leaders such as Sylvester, the Bishop of Rome, Paul, who later became Bishop of Constantinople, and Eusebius of Caesarea, an early historian of the Christian Church, are described as influential figures who contributed to shaping imperial attitudes and encouraging opposition toward the Jewish communities within the empire. Judaism, in the official language of imperial Roman authority during the early 4th century of the Common Era, was increasingly described in hostile and degrading terms. It was labeled as a harmful and immoral sect, a belief system accused of being dangerous to public order and religious unity within the Roman Empire. In this atmosphere, imperial policy moved toward its restriction and eventual elimination wherever possible. Around the year 315 of the Common Era, an imperial decree was issued by the Roman government under the reign of Emperor Constantine the Great. This law explicitly prohibited the Jewish population from actively seeking converts to their faith. Not only were individuals forbidden to join Judaism, but those who attempted to guide or receive them into the religion were also threatened with punishment under Roman law. At the same time, imperial policy shifted decisively in favor of Christianity. The Roman state began to support Christian missionary activity, allowing the expansion of Christian influence across the empire. In contrast, Jewish religious authority was legally restricted, particularly in relation to those who abandoned the Jewish faith and converted to Christianity. Roman law imposed severe consequences on those who attempted to prevent apostasy from Christianity. A decree stated that anyone who attacked converts to Christianity, whether by physical violence such as stoning or by any other form of harm, would themselves be punished by death, often by burning, along with anyone who assisted them. This created a legal environment in which conversion away from Judaism toward Christianity was actively protected by the imperial state. In this period, under Emperor Constantine, Jewish communities faced increasing pressure. The imperial government combined religious preference with political advantage, making Christianity socially and materially attractive. As a result, individuals from within the Jewish population, especially those without strong religious commitment, were tempted to convert in exchange for social advancement and political benefit. Christian leaders actively encouraged conversion. They promised positions of authority such as administrative leadership, military command, and regional governance to those who abandoned Judaism. At the same time, they emphasized the suffering and hardship experienced by the Jewish people, presenting conversion as a path toward relief and opportunity within the imperial system. Jewish religious teachers were therefore placed in a difficult position. Their public teachings began to address this crisis directly, warning their communities about the persuasive power of Roman authority. They described the empire as a hostile force attempting to weaken religious loyalty through promises and pressure, and they urged steadfastness in the face of these challenges. During the same period, the Roman Emperor Constantine revoked several traditional privileges that had previously been granted to the Jewish population. In certain cities, such as the Roman colony of Cologne and the western provinces of the empire, Jews were subjected to new civic obligations. With few exceptions, they were required to participate in burdensome municipal responsibilities, which placed additional strain on their communities. Around the year 325 of the Common Era, a major event took place that would shape the future of Christianity and its relationship with Judaism. This was the First Council of Nicaea, a large assembly of Christian bishops and church leaders from across the Roman Empire. The council was convened under the direct authority of Emperor Constantine himself, who presided over the gathering as a unifying political figure. This assembly marked the first formal attempt to define Christian doctrine on a universal scale. However, rather than displaying unity, the council revealed deep internal disagreements within Christianity itself. The central debate focused on the relationship between Jesus Christ, regarded as the Son in Christian theology, and God the Father. Different factions argued over whether the Son was equal to the Father, similar to him, or distinct in nature. These theological disputes became increasingly intense, and the inability to reach consensus exposed divisions within the Christian leadership. As a result, the original ethical teachings associated with early Christianity, such as humility, shared responsibility, and moral discipline, were overshadowed by doctrinal conflict and institutional power struggles. During this same period, a significant religious separation occurred between Christianity and Judaism. One of the most important symbolic practices affected by this division was the calculation of the date of the Christian festival of Easter. Previously, this festival had often been observed in close proximity to the Jewish festival of Passover, and its timing was sometimes determined using calculations provided by the Jewish religious authorities, specifically the Sanhedrin of Judea. After the Council of Nicaea, a new policy was established. The celebration of Easter was to be completely independent of the Jewish calendar. This decision was justified through arguments that it was inappropriate for the most important Christian festival to depend on Jewish calculations or traditions. The intention was to create a distinct religious identity separate from Judaism. This shift was reinforced by statements attributed to Emperor Constantine, who is said to have supported the idea that Christianity should no longer share religious frameworks with Judaism. Whether these exact words were personally spoken by the emperor or formulated by church leaders in his name, they reflected the official direction of Christian policy at the time. From this point forward, the relationship between Christianity and Judaism became increasingly hostile. The separation established at the Council of Nicaea contributed to later imperial policies that restricted Jewish life and reinforced Christian dominance within the Roman Empire. One of the earliest measures associated with Emperor Constantine was the reinforcement of older Roman restrictions that prevented Jews from residing in Jerusalem. This law, originally introduced under Emperor Hadrian after the suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century of the Common Era, was reaffirmed. Jews were only permitted to enter the city on specific commemorative days, and even then only under strict conditions, often involving payment to Roman authorities in order to mourn the destruction of the temple. Additional laws were also introduced that prohibited Jews from converting non-Jewish slaves to Judaism. Christianity, now closely aligned with imperial power, was granted exclusive rights to expand its religious influence. Judaism, by contrast, was legally restricted from engaging in similar forms of religious expansion. Despite this restrictive environment, Roman authorities occasionally protected Jews from violence committed by individuals who had converted to Christianity and later turned against their former community. Some of these converts used their new status within the Christian system to gain influence and then acted against Jewish populations. One such individual was a man named Joseph, who had previously served within the Jewish religious administration as an assistant in the court of the Patriarch in the city of Tiberias, a major center of Jewish learning in the land of Israel. He had also been sent as an official representative to Jewish communities in the region of Cilicia, an area located in the southeastern part of Asia Minor. During his time in Cilicia, Joseph secretly associated with a Christian bishop and gained access to Christian sacred writings. Suspicion arose among the Jewish communities regarding his loyalty to Judaism. His behavior, combined with tensions caused by his strict enforcement of authority during his earlier position, led to growing hostility toward him. Eventually, a group of Cilician Jews entered his residence unexpectedly and discovered him reading Christian scripture, confirming suspicions of his conversion. This event reflects the increasing tensions and suspicions that characterize the relationship between Jewish communities and Christian converts during this transformative period of Roman imperial history. In the region of Cilicia, a Roman province located in the eastern part of the empire along the Mediterranean coastline, there arose a story centered on a man named Joseph, whose actions had created deep resentment among the local Jewish communities. It is said that the anger directed at him became so intense that members of the Jewish population of Cilicia seized him and threw him into the river Cydnus, a river flowing through that region. According to his own account, he survived this event only through what he described as a miraculous escape, an intervention beyond natural explanation. Following this incident, Joseph found himself in a position where he could no longer maintain his previous identity within the Jewish community. He publicly declared his acceptance of Christianity, the rapidly expanding religious movement that by this period was gaining increasing influence within the Roman Empire. In his writings, Joseph claimed that many Jews at that time, including individuals of high learning and moral reputation, were secretly inclined toward Christian belief, although this assertion reflected his personal interpretation and was widely disputed. Joseph also recounted a controversial narrative concerning the Jewish patriarch, most likely referring to Judah III, who was the formal head of the Jewish community in the land of Judea. In this account, Joseph suggested that the patriarch himself had secretly sympathized with the Christian faith and had even desired baptism, the Christian rite of initiation. At the same time, the Christian clergy in the land of Judea, possibly including Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea, a prominent ecclesiastical figure who enjoyed favor with the Roman imperial court, supported Joseph after his conversion. As a result of this support, the Roman Emperor Constantine granted Joseph the title of comes, a high imperial rank that carried privileges including a degree of legal protection and exemption from certain forms of punishment, even in cases of misconduct. In addition, Joseph received imperial authorization to construct the first Christian churches in several key cities of Galilee, including Tiberias, Sepphoris, also known as Dio-Caesarea, Nazareth, and Capernaum, locations where Christian communities had previously been minimal or almost non-existent. Joseph further directed his accusations toward the successor of the patriarch, Hillel II, who is said to have been still a minor at the time of his father's death. Joseph portrayed Hillel as having been under his own guardianship and accused him of moral corruption, claiming that he had been led into indulgent behavior by companions and had engaged in misconduct, including the seduction of women through alleged magical practices. These accusations were intended both to discredit a leading figure of the Jewish community and to support claims regarding the superiority of the Christian faith. However, historical accounts describe Hillel II, who held leadership from approximately the year 320 to 365 of the Common Era, as a respected and capable religious authority within the Jewish tradition. He is regarded as one of the more significant successors of the earlier Hillel, and there is no reliable evidence that he adopted Christianity. Instead, he functioned within the established structure of Jewish leadership during a period of increasing tension with the Roman imperial authorities and the Christian ecclesiastical establishment. During the reign of Emperor Constantius, approximately from the year 327 to 330 of the Common Era, the political environment of the Roman Empire shifted toward formal Christian dominance. Constantius, known for his authoritarian rule and harsh policies against groups labeled as heretical, played a decisive role in shaping state support for Christianity. Under his authority, religious policy became closely tied to imperial command, with the emperor asserting that his will should determine religious law, effectively merging political power with doctrinal enforcement. This period marked the beginning of significant hardship for the Jewish population within the empire. Influential Christian officials gained increasing control over imperial decisions, and religious disputes often escalated into political actions. In this environment, Jewish teachers of the law were expelled from their positions, and some were forced to leave the land of Judea entirely, migrating to Babylonia, which remained a major center of Jewish life outside Roman control. Among those exiled were scholars such as Dime and Isaac, son of Joseph. As these pressures intensified, further groups of scholars also left Judea, including Abin and Samuel son of Judah, during the years 337 to 338 of the Common Era. This migration contributed to the decline of the academy in Tiberias, one of the central institutions of Jewish learning, leading to a weakening of formal instruction and communal authority in the region. During this transitional period, a form of centralized council still existed, resembling the earlier Sanhedrin, a governing body responsible for religious and legal decisions. Members of this council included figures such as Haggai, Jonah, and Hosea, who participated in maintaining legal discussions and communal governance through established voting procedures. At the same time, new imperial laws were introduced under Constantius that directly affected Jewish life. One such law, issued in the year 339 of the Common Era, imposed the death penalty on any marriage between a Jewish man and a Christian woman, reflecting increasing religious separation enforced by state authority. Another major law concerned slavery and religious conversion. Previous imperial policy had already restricted the ownership of slaves who converted to Judaism, but Constantius expanded these restrictions dramatically. Under his new decree, the circumcision of a Christian slave, an act marking conversion to Judaism, was punishable by death and confiscation of property. Even the acceptance of non-Christian slaves into the Jewish religious community was prohibited. These laws were justified by imperial ideology that viewed Christianity as the favored religion of the empire and regarded Jewish religious authority with hostility. Although Jews were still legally considered Roman citizens and theoretically entitled to equal protection under imperial law, in practice these protections were increasingly overridden by religiously motivated legislation. Decisions of law were shaped less by traditional legal institutions and more by the influence of imperial authority and the Christian leadership surrounding the court. Thus, under Constantius, the Roman state increasingly aligned itself with the Christian ecclesiastical structure, and this alignment marked a turning point in the relationship between imperial power, emerging Christian authority, and the Jewish communities of the empire. The suffering of the Jewish population reached an extreme level during the reign of the Roman Emperor Constantius, when he dispatched his cousin and co-emperor Gallus to the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire in the year 351. Gallus, described in historical accounts as a ruler absorbed in personal indulgence and excess, did not directly conduct military operations. Instead, he entrusted the management of the campaign to his military commander, Ursicinus, a Roman general responsible for enforcing imperial authority in the eastern territories. During a prolonged period of approximately 3 years, Ursicinus exerted severe pressure upon the province of Judea, causing conditions that exceeded even earlier periods of Roman control. Roman legions were stationed in the cities of Judea, transforming urban centers into military supply zones. The Roman commander required the Jewish population to provide continuous provisions for the soldiers, imposing demands that disrupted the normal rhythm of religious and communal life. These demands extended even into the most sensitive areas of religious observance. Military authorities insisted that fresh bread be supplied to Roman troops regardless of the sacred calendar, including the Sabbath, the weekly day of rest in Jewish law, and the festival of unleavened bread, known as Passover, during which consumption of leavened bread is strictly forbidden according to Jewish religious tradition. Faced with these pressures, the communities of Judea experienced deep internal conflict. Religious teachers, known as sages of the Halacha, the system of Jewish legal tradition, attempted to find ways to reconcile survival with religious obligation. In some communities, leading authorities such as Jonah and Hosea from the city of Tiberias ruled that baking bread for the Roman army on the Sabbath was permitted under the circumstances. In another region, a community in the area of Gaulonitis, near a town called Neve, permitted the baking of leavened bread during Passover for the Roman legions. These legal accommodations were justified by the argument that the Roman authorities were not explicitly demanding the violation of religious law, but only requiring regular military supplies. Nevertheless, the underlying implication was that adherence to Jewish law was being overridden by external political force. This created a profound moral tension within the religious leadership of the time. At the same time, evidence suggests that Ursicinus may have acted not merely as a military administrator, but as an agent of religious oppression. In a town located near Tiberias, called Synbaris, approximately 4 Roman miles away, a sacred scroll of the Torah, the central written text of Jewish law, was publicly burned. This act was interpreted not as a military necessity, but as a symbolic attack on religious identity and tradition. Alongside these events, the Jewish population of Judea was burdened with multiple layers of taxation imposed by the Roman administration. These included agricultural levies on grain and livestock, a poll tax imposed on individuals, a general tribute to the empire, taxes on commercial activity, and additional fines imposed under various legal categories. The cumulative effect of these obligations led to widespread economic distress among the population. Religious leaders responded to these conditions in their public teachings. One homiletic interpretation compared the situation of the Jewish people under Roman rule, referred to symbolically as the rule of Esau in traditional interpretation, to a garment caught in thorns. Once one part is freed, another is immediately torn. This metaphor illustrated the continuous and unrelenting nature of Roman taxation and legal pressure, where one burden followed another without relief. In response to these accumulated pressures, a rebellion eventually broke out. Although historical sources preserve only fragmented details, it is clear that the center of this uprising was the city of Sepphoris, an important urban center in Galilee. Under cover of night, local Jewish forces attacked Roman troops stationed in the city, killing them and seizing their weapons. According to some accounts, leadership of this uprising was attributed to a figure named Patricius, also referred to in some traditions as Netera, who was elevated to a position of authority by the rebels. From Sepphoris, the rebellion expanded into surrounding regions, with incursions carried out against Roman positions and allied settlements. Similar disturbances occurred in other key cities of the region, including Tiberias and Lydda, as well as additional smaller settlements. The rebellion thus spread across multiple centers of Jewish population in the province, requiring a coordinated Roman response. In reaction, Emperor Constantius reinforced the eastern command with additional Roman legions under Gallus. With these reinforcements, the Roman forces were able to suppress the rebellion decisively. However, the suppression was conducted with extreme severity. Large numbers of combatants and civilians were killed, including individuals who were not directly involved in armed resistance. Sepphoris was destroyed as a punitive measure, and other cities, such as Tiberias and Lydda, suffered partial destruction. The aftermath of the rebellion was marked by systematic pursuit of those who had participated in or supported the uprising. Roman forces, particularly under Ursicinus, conducted searches aimed at identifying all individuals connected to the revolt. In an attempt to evade capture, some inhabitants of Sepphoris concealed their identities by disguising their appearance. For a period, this allowed them to avoid detection. However, informants eventually revealed the concealment strategy to Roman authorities, leading to the arrest and execution of many fugitives. Other survivors sought refuge in underground passages beneath the city of Tiberias. These subterranean hiding places served as temporary shelters during the Roman search operations. One account from this period describes how the refugees used torches to distinguish between day and night, observing changes in light intensity as their only measure of time while remaining hidden underground. During or shortly after this period of unrest, imperial policy appears to have intensified further restrictions on Jewish religious life. Under Constantius, measures were introduced that prohibited the public practice of religious observances. The calculation of the religious calendar, essential for determining festivals and sacred times, was also restricted. Even trade in religiously significant objects was limited. Communication between Jewish communities regarding these prohibitions required secrecy and indirect expression. When instructions had to be transmitted to Rabbah, the head of the academies in the city of Machusa in Babylonia, messages concerning calendar adjustment and religious restrictions were conveyed in coded and indirect language, reflecting the risks associated with open correspondence under imperial surveillance. A secret communication from the land of Judea to the Jewish communities in Babylonia was transmitted in a coded and symbolic form, reflecting a period of severe political and religious pressure. The message reported that men had come from Riket, meaning the city of Tiberias in Judea, and that the Roman authorities, symbolically described as an eagle representing imperial Rome, had seized them. These individuals were associated with the preparation of a special dyed material used for ritual fringes, known as the blue-purple dye produced in Luz, an ancient location associated with traditional Jewish craftsmanship for religious garments. Despite this arrest and pressure, the message emphasized that through divine mercy and their own merits, the individuals had managed to escape safely. The communication further stated that the successors of Nachshon, referring to the leadership line of the Jewish Patriarchate, had intended to establish the regulation of the intercalation of the calendar month, meaning the addition of a leap month in the Jewish calendar. However, the Roman authorities, referred to in the text as Aramenes, prevented them from carrying out this function freely. Nevertheless, the Jewish authorities managed to convene secretly and proceeded to declare the intercalation of the month associated with the commemoration of the death of Aaron, the biblical high priest. This concealed letter sent to Babylonia reveals the level of disruption and constraint affecting Judea during this period, particularly in relation to religious authority and calendar regulation. The weakened and pressured Sanhedrin, the central Jewish religious court responsible for determining legal and calendrical decisions, appears to have been prevented from performing its traditional role of adding the regular extra month in the spring period known as Adar. Instead, it was forced to shift this adjustment to an irregular time not formally sanctioned by established religious tradition. This disruption represented a significant breakdown in the normal functioning of Jewish religious governance. During this same period, there are reports that the Jewish population was even prohibited from observing the Day of Atonement, one of the most sacred days in the Jewish religious calendar. As a result, they were compelled to postpone its observance to the Sabbath, an adjustment that reflects the extent of external interference in religious practice. The difficult condition of Judea did not improve with the removal of certain Roman officials, including Gallus, who had been executed under the orders of Emperor Constantius, nor with the political decline of Ursicinus, another Roman figure removed from power around 354 of the Common Era. Within the imperial court in Constantinople, Jews were increasingly regarded as atheists due to their refusal to recognize Jesus within the Christian theological framework. This perception led to a legal decree issued in 357 of the Common Era, stating that any Christians who joined Jewish communities would lose their property as punishment. Officials within the imperial administration, including individuals such as Eusebius, who serve in a high court position, promoted policies aimed at confiscating Jewish property and imposing heavy and unjust taxation. These measures were intended to weaken the Jewish population economically and reduce its capacity for survival, under the justification that those labeled as atheists were not entitled to imperial protection. Additional tax regulations were prepared to further intensify this financial pressure. This situation was unexpectedly altered by the rise of Emperor Julian, who differed significantly from both his predecessor Gallus and his co-Emperor Constantius. Julian's policies temporarily eased the severity of restrictions imposed on the Jewish population. Amid this atmosphere of crisis, the Patriarch Hillel II undertook a major and historically significant reform. Until this time, the Jewish calendar system had been managed centrally by the Sanhedrin, which would determine the appearance of the new moon and the intercalation of leap months, and then communicate festival dates to distant communities through messengers. However, under the conditions of persecution during the reign of Constantius, this system became unreliable and ineffective. The inability of the central authority to communicate properly created widespread uncertainty among Jewish communities scattered across different regions. In response to this instability, Hillel II introduced a fixed and calculated calendar system. This reform established a permanent method for determining the timing of months and religious festivals, making it possible for all Jewish communities to calculate the calendar independently without relying on central notification from Judea. This act effectively ended the exclusive authority of the Sanhedrin over calendar determination and transferred that knowledge into a standardized system accessible to all dispersed communities. This decision represented a profound shift, as it removed one of the last functional links connecting the global Jewish population to the central authority in Judea. Although the Patriarchate had originally guarded this responsibility as a symbol of its authority, Hillel II chose stability over institutional prestige, prioritizing the continuity of religious practice over centralized control. The members of the Sanhedrin supported this reform, but emphasized that certain traditional practices should remain unchanged. In particular, they insisted that the second day of festivals, which had long been observed by Jewish communities outside Judea due to earlier uncertainty in calendar communication, should continue to be observed. Instructions were sent to communities in Alexandria and Babylonia, affirming that although the calendar had now been made clear, ancestral customs must not be abandoned. The new system established by Hillel II was based on a structured 19-year cycle, in which 7 years were designated as leap years to maintain alignment between lunar months and seasonal requirements. Most months were fixed in length, alternating between 29 and 30 days, while certain autumn months remained adjustable based on astronomical observation and religious calculation. This system allowed even individuals without specialized training to compute the calendar over long periods of time with accuracy. Although it is not fully clear how much of this system was newly created by Hillel II and how much was inherited from earlier tradition, it is known that earlier scholarly materials, including those associated with Samuel, a Babylonian scholar, contributed to its structure. The calendar was formally introduced in the year 359 of the Common Era. While Judea experienced increasing restriction and loss of institutional authority, the intellectual life of Babylonia continued to expand. Even as external forces weakened the central structures of Jewish life in Judea, Babylonia developed into an increasingly dominant center of study and legal interpretation, strengthening the continuity of Jewish intellectual tradition in a different geographical and political environment. In the Babylonian centers of Jewish learning, two distinct methods of transmitting sacred tradition gradually took shape, each shaping the intellectual identity of a major academy. One method focused on strict preservation. It emphasized receiving the exact wording of earlier teachings and transmitting them without alteration. This approach treated tradition as something fixed, to be carefully guarded. The Great Academy of Sora in Babylonia, founded in the generation following the earliest Babylonian teachers, became the main home of this approach. Sora functioned as a continuation of the earlier academies of the land of Israel, especially those of Tiberias, and was often described as a Babylonian counterpart to that earlier spiritual center. Although its intellectual atmosphere was shaped by Babylonia's own scholarly environment, its contribution to innovation in legal interpretation remained limited. In contrast, the Academy of Pumbeditha developed a very different intellectual character. It did not merely preserve tradition. It actively analyzed, expanded, and reshaped it through argument and reasoning. This creative method turned inherited teachings into a system of sharp legal reasoning and structured debate. Over time, Pumbeditha became the leading force in Babylonian scholarship, elevating intellectual analysis to its highest level. During this period, the leadership of Pumbeditha was associated with a remarkable intellectual generation formed under Judah ben Ezekiel, a major Babylonian teacher who had established the academy and shaped its analytical style. From this environment emerged three central figures who together formed a kind of scholarly triumvirate: Rabbah, Abai, and Rabbah. These three became the defining authorities of their generation, and their combined work brought the development of legal interpretation closer to what would later be recognized as the structured foundation of the Babylonian Talmud, particularly in its method of dialectical reasoning. Rabbi Bar Nachmani, born around the year 270 of the Common Era and deceased around the year 330, stood at the center of this intellectual transformation. He came from a family associated with Mamel or Mamala, a settlement in the region of Galilee in the land of Israel. This community was traditionally linked to priestly ancestry connected to the family of Aaron, the brother of Moses, but also to the lineage of Eli, a priestly house described in earlier sacred tradition as carrying a legacy of hardship. Within this family tradition, there was a belief that a generational limitation affected longevity as a consequence of an ancient moral narrative associated with that lineage. This belief shaped how members of the family interpreted their recurring experiences of hardship and poverty. Rabbah had three brothers named Kailil, Ashiah, and Shenaniah. Their lives were marked by economic difficulty, which they also associated with the same inherited tradition of misfortune. Two of the brothers, Ashiah and Shenaniah, lived for a time in the land of Israel and worked in manual trade as shoemakers. Their financial condition was unstable, and at times they were forced to sell their products in circumstances that reflected severe economic pressure. Yet despite these conditions, they were regarded as morally disciplined and intellectually pure, especially because they devoted themselves to narrative interpretation of tradition, known as Agada, a form of teaching that focused on ethical and interpretive expansion of sacred texts. Because of their reputation for moral integrity, they were referred to as exemplary figures within the land of Israel. Rabbah, in contrast, devoted himself to the analytical legal method known as halacha, the system of legal interpretation governing religious law. From childhood, he was recognized for intellectual sharpness and developed into one of the most influential legal thinkers of his generation. Unlike his brothers, he remained in Babylonia and built his scholarly life there, even as his family urged him to relocate to the land of Israel, which they regarded as spiritually superior due to its association with earlier generations of scholars and prophets. They argued that burial in the land of Israel carried spiritual significance, and that intellectual life there remained richer. Despite their persuasion, Rabbah initially remained in Babylonia, though he later spent a period in the land of Israel before returning, likely due to differences in scholarly approach between the two regions. After the death of Judah ben Ezekiel in the year 299 of the Common Era, leadership of the Pumbeditha Academy became a matter of great importance. The scholars of that institution recognized Rabbah as the most suitable successor due to his exceptional analytical ability. However, he declined a position out of modesty. The leadership was then assigned to Hunah ben Chia, a wealthy figure whose resources allowed him to support the academy generously, even providing decorated seating for its participants. Although Pumbeditha continued to attract a large number of students, internal tensions emerged regarding the legitimacy of leadership and the sources of wealth used to support the academy. When it became known that Hunah ben Chia's wealth was derived from the collection of tolls, a form of taxation associated with trade regulation, concerns were raised among scholars who considered such activity ethically problematic for a religious leader. He was therefore compelled to abandon that occupation in order to maintain his position as head of the academy. After his removal, the question of leadership returned to Rabbah and Joseph ben Chia. Rabbah was recognized for his mastery of dialectical reasoning, while Joseph was known for deep expertise in traditional legal knowledge. The difficulty of choosing between them led the scholars to send a formal inquiry to the land of Israel, asking which quality was superior, extensive learning or sharp analytical ability. The response from the scholars of Tiberias favored established learning over intellectual sharpness, reflecting the traditional intellectual priorities of that region. Joseph, who had recently become a figure surrounded by controversy and uncertainty, found himself facing an offer of great authority within the Jewish scholarly world. Yet before he accepted anything, he was haunted by an old prediction. A Chaldean astrologer, a practitioner from the ancient Babylonian tradition of interpreting fate through celestial signs, had once examined his nativity. That astrologer had declared that Joseph would rise to a position of great power, but would only remain in that position for 2 years and 6 months, after which his life would come to an end. Even though the legal tradition of the Jewish teachers of the law explicitly prohibited reliance on Chaldean predictions, fear and habit still influenced many scholars. The authority of daily experience often overpowered the written rule. Thus, Joseph, despite being offered this high office, hesitated. In the end, he refused to accept it. Because of his refusal, the position did not remain vacant. It was transferred to Rabbah in the year 309 of the Common Era. Rabbah became the head of the Academy of Pumbeditha, one of the 2 major centers of Jewish learning in Babylonia, alongside Sora. The Academy of Pumbeditha functioned as a central institution where scholars known as Amoraim, meaning interpreters of the earlier Mishnah, gathered to analyze, debate, and expand Jewish law. Under Rabbah, the Academy of Pumbeditha experienced a dramatic revival. The institution regained its intellectual strength and drew enormous crowds of students, sometimes reaching as many as 1,200 learners at a time. Rabbah did not limit his teaching to practical legal rulings alone, as earlier teachers, such as Judah, had done. Instead, he addressed the entire scope of the Mishnah, the foundational compilation of Jewish oral law. Even areas that had become largely theoretical, such as the complex laws of ritual purity connected to the ancient temple system, receive his attention. Although these laws were no longer practiced in daily life, Rabbah attempted to make them understandable again. Yet in this subject he stood almost alone, and he often lamented that he had few who could follow him in such abstract study. Rabbah was also known for probing deeply into the reasoning behind laws. He asked fundamental questions about the purpose of commandments found in the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, as well as later rabbinic enactments from the Sepharic and Mishnaic traditions. His teaching style was framed by questions such as, why did the law command this action? Or why did the sages forbid that practice? His lectures were not only intellectual, but also carefully structured to engage his students. He often began with stories or brief, entertaining remarks, designed to prepare the minds of his audience. Only after creating a state of attentiveness would he transition into complex legal analysis. His principle was that the human mind must first be open and receptive, and that this openness was best achieved through a balanced state of seriousness and calm engagement. Rabbah also tested his students through challenging questions and paradoxical statements. These were not intended to confuse, but to sharpen reasoning and develop independent judgment. In this respect, Rabbah held a position among the Babylonian Amoraim comparable to the earlier authority of Aqaba among the Tannaitic sages of the Mishnah period. He organized scattered legal traditions into broader conceptual categories, giving structure to an expanding intellectual system. Because of this, he was deeply respected by scholars, who regarded him as a foundational figure in Babylonian Jewish legal development. However, his relationship with the general population of Pumbeditha was far more tense. The people of the city resented his strict moral criticism and his sharp rebukes against dishonesty and manipulation. During a severe drought, when Rabbah declared a public fast and led communal prayers for rain, his efforts appeared unsuccessful. In response, he addressed the people with a harsh rebuke. He declared that the failure was not due to the inferiority of their generation compared to the time of his teacher Judah, nor due to a decline in Torah study among scholars. Instead, he placed responsibility on the moral condition of the people themselves, stating that the generation had become corrupt and unworthy, leaving even its leaders powerless to change divine decree. Despite his intellectual authority, Rabbah and another scholar named Ada lived under financial difficulty. Both of them appear to have served alongside Mar Uqban, who was a grandson of Rab and held the political position of Prince of the Captivity. The Prince of the Captivity was a hereditary leader of Babylonian Jewry, believed to descend from the ancient royal house of David. He held both political and communal authority and often supported scholars from his own resources. Unlike the wealthy Academy of Sora, where leaders often funded students directly, the Academy of Pumbeditha struggled with limited resources. This led to the creation of a communal funding system supported by contributions from Jewish communities and possibly from the prince of the captivity himself, ensuring the continuation of scholarly study. During Rabba's lifetime, Babylonian Jewry faced a temporary but significant persecution under the rule of Shapur II, the Sasanian monarch of Persia who ruled from 310 to 380 of the Common Era. The Sasanian dynasty was the ruling Persian imperial house, and Shapur II was notable for having been declared king even before his birth, symbolizing the extreme authority of the monarchy. Although relations between Jews and Persian authorities had previously been relatively stable, they now became strained. However, Shapur's mother, Afra Ormuzd, showed favorable attitudes toward the Jewish community, which helped prevent a full-scale suppression. At one point, military forces entered the region of Pumbeditha. Rabba and Joseph were forced to flee. The immediate cause of the accusation against Rabba was a claim made to the royal authorities that his public teachings during the Kalam months, the seasonal gatherings of students in the academies, had encouraged thousands of students to avoid paying the imperial poll tax imposed on adult males. A royal official was therefore sent with orders to arrest him. Warned in advance, Rabba escaped and wandered in hiding across the surrounding regions. During this period of flight, his fear and exhaustion reached a breaking point. Hearing the rustling of wind in the trees, he mistakenly believed that soldiers were approaching. The shock caused by this fear led to his sudden death. His disciples, including Abai and Rabba, who were among the most prominent scholars of the next generation, searched for his body together with the members of the academy. They eventually found his remains in a hidden place where birds had covered it. They observed 7 days of mourning for him, recognizing the end of one of the most influential Amoraic leaders in Babylonian Jewish history. The accusation that had led to these events was never pursued further. In a surprising act of restraint, the Queen Mother Ifra Ormuzd even sent a purse of coins to Rabba's successor, instructing that it be used for a righteous purpose. The funds were ultimately used for the redemption of Jewish captives. Rabba's successor and close companion in the Babylonian academies was Joseph ben Shia, a scholar born around the year 270 and who lived until approximately the year 333. He is described in tradition as a man of fragile health and deep emotional sensitivity, with a passionate inner temperament. He was conscious of his own limitations and often expressed regret that his physical condition and emotional intensity prevented him from experiencing life with ease. Despite these vulnerabilities, Joseph ben Shia appears to have been materially wealthy. He owned agricultural estates, including cultivated fields, groves of palm trees, and vineyards. His agricultural activity was carried out with unusual care and precision. And because of this attention to detail, the wine produced from his vineyards was considered superior to the common standard of production in Babylonia. At a later stage in his life, Joseph ben Shia became blind. Yet the tradition emphasizes a striking aspect of his response. He did not grieve primarily over the loss of sight itself, but rather over the fact that blindness exempted him from certain religious obligations that required visual participation and awareness. This detail reflects the intensity with which he valued religious duty. Within the scholarly environment of the Academy of Pumbeditha, one of the major centers of Babylonian Jewish learning, Joseph ben Shia held a distinctive intellectual position. While many scholars emphasized analytical reasoning and interpretive innovation in legal discussion, Joseph placed greater importance on memorization of tradition. He focused intensely on mastering the Mishnah, the foundational codified collection of oral Jewish law, and the Borei Toth, external early teachings not included in the Mishnah, but still authoritative in legal discourse. Because of this encyclopedic retention of tradition, he was given the symbolic title Sinai, referring to the mountain of revelation associated with the giving of the law, and possessor of storehouses, indicating that he functioned as a vast repository of transmitted knowledge. His intellectual authority was therefore based not on argumentation, but on preservation and accurate recollection of inherited tradition. In addition to his work on halacha, the system of Jewish legal interpretation, Joseph ben Chia devoted attention to the Targum, the Aramaic translation and interpretation of the Hebrew Scriptures. At this time, the Torah, meaning the Pentateuch, or 5 books of Moses, and selected portions of the prophets used in synagogue readings known as the Haftorah, had long been translated into Aramaic dialect for communities that no longer fully understood Hebrew. Among these translations was Targum Onkelos, a widely used Aramaic rendering of the Torah, and the Syriac translation known as the Peshitta, used by Jewish communities in Syria and Mesopotamia who spoke Syriac. However, large portions of the prophets had not yet been systematically translated into Aramaic. Joseph ben Chia undertook the task of translating these remaining sections into Aramaic. Some contemporaries interpreted this effort as an act of piety, motivated by his blindness and his inability to read directly from written Hebrew texts. At the same time, he was reluctant to recite the Hebrew scriptures from memory in a way that might contradict accepted restrictions regarding oral transmission of written law. His translation, therefore, served both a practical and religious function, allowing access to the text in a form suitable for public and personal recitation. His Aramaic rendering of the prophets was later incorporated into the broader Targum tradition and came to be regarded as an authoritative reference in the interpretation of difficult passages. In his role as head of the Academy of Pumbedita, Joseph ben Chia was known for strict discipline. On one occasion, he imposed corporal punishment on a student named Nathan Bar Asa for traveling on foot from the academy to the city of Pumbedita on the second day of a religious festival, an act considered a violation of festival regulations in that context. The final years of Joseph ben Chia's leadership were marked by physical suffering and intellectual decline due to illness. He developed a condition that affected his memory, causing him at times to forget teachings he himself had previously transmitted. His students would often need to remind him of his own earlier interpretations, a situation that caused him deep emotional distress. Although they attempted to correct him gently, he perceived these reminders as personal humiliation. In response, he compared his condition to the broken fragments of the first set of stone tablets of the law preserved alongside the intact second tablets, using this metaphor to express his sense of diminished continuity rather than complete loss. Joseph ben Chia's condition is presented in tradition as symbolic of a broader transition in the methods of scholarly transmission. The earlier system, which relied heavily on memorization and oral retention, was shown to be vulnerable to the fragility of human memory. A vast body of tradition could be carefully accumulated and preserved, yet still risk sudden loss or distortion when memory failed, leaving no reliable means of recovery once it disappeared. At the same time, the Academy of Sura, another major center of Babylonian Jewish learning, began to experience a gradual decline in intellectual influence. After the death of the scholar Chasta, leadership passed for approximately 12 years, from the year 309 to 320, to Rabbah, also known as Rab Abba, the son of Hunah. However, during this period, students increasingly turned away from Sura and gravitated instead toward the more dynamic Academy of Pumbedita, which was gaining prominence. Rabbah's reputation was characterized more by personal modesty than by widespread doctrinal innovation. After his death, the Academy of Sura entered a period of decline and remained largely inactive for several decades before later experiencing a revival of scholarly activity. Following the death of Joseph ben Chia, the Academy of Pumbedita faced the problem of selecting a successor. 4 scholars emerged as leading candidates: Abai, Rabbah, Zira II, and Rabbah bar Matana. To determine the successor, a test was established in which each candidate would respond to a difficult legal question, and the most compelling answer would determine the appointment. Abai emerged victorious in this intellectual selection process and was appointed head of the academy. Abai, also known by the name Nachmani, was born around the year 280 and died in the year 338. He was orphaned at birth, as his father Khalil died before his birth and his mother died immediately afterward. He was raised under the care of a guardian who acted in the place of his mother, while Rabbah, a leading scholar of Pumbedita, served as his intellectual mentor in the place of a father. Abai later expressed deep gratitude toward his foster caretaker and even associated her name with certain medicinal formulations. From Rabbah, he received training in legal reasoning and dialectical analysis of the Talmudic tradition. Together with his contemporary Rabbah, he was recognized in youth as a rising intellectual figure, leading observers to remark that early development reveals future potential, just as a young bud indicates the nature of a mature fruit. Abai is described as possessing modest economic means. Like many Babylonian scholars, he maintained a small agricultural property, which he cultivated through hired labor. His character is consistently portrayed as gentle and accommodating. His guiding principle emphasized intellectual depth combined with moral sensitivity, wisdom and reverence toward God, kindness in speech, reconciliation in human relationships, and peaceful coexistence even with those outside the Jewish community, so that a person might earn respect and moral influence among all people. At this stage of Babylonian Jewish history, words, actions, and moral judgment were still expected to align completely, as if speech, intention, and deed formed a single unified standard of truth within society. In this environment lived Abai, one of the leading Babylonian Amoraim, the scholarly interpreters of the Mishnah in the Talmudic academies. His integrity was so widely recognized that even the Samaritan communities residing in Babylonia acknowledged his honesty and fairness. One narrative records that Abai once lost a donkey, and the animal was later found by Samaritans. Although they could not identify it through any special physical mark provided by Abai, they still returned it to him. They explained their decision by stating that if he had not been known as Nachmani, a name associated with his reputation, they would not have returned the animal, even if identifying marks had been given. This episode reflects the level of trust his character had earned even among groups that were not part of the mainstream Jewish scholarly community. Abai served as the head of the academy in Pumbedita, one of the most important centers of Jewish learning in Babylonia, between the years 333 and 338 of the Common Era. During his leadership, the number of students declined to approximately 200. In comparison to earlier generations, when the academies under leaders such as Rab and Huna had been filled with large assemblies of students, Abai felt as though he was left with a greatly reduced scholarly community. He described himself in a state of emotional and intellectual isolation, referring to himself as an orphan of orphans, indicating that he felt cut off from the fullness of earlier academic generations. This decline in numbers was not caused by a loss of interest in study. Rather, it resulted from the presence of a major intellectual rival institution led by Rabbah, who had established a separate academy in the city of Mechuza on the banks of the Tigris River. Rabbah's school attracted many students away from Pumbedita, creating a situation of scholarly competition between the two academies. Despite this division, both Abai and Rabbah contributed significantly to the refinement of Babylonian Talmudic interpretation. Their intellectual exchanges elevated the analytical method of study to its highest level. The traditions inherited from earlier generations were no longer sufficient as the sole subject of discussion, since most foundational issues had already been examined and explained. As a result, the scholars of this period developed new methods of reasoning, applying established logical frameworks to generate new interpretations and solutions. These intricate analytical discussions became a defining feature of Babylonian Talmudic study and were later identified by the combined intellectual contributions of Abai and Rabbah. These analytical traditions were eventually referred to as the reflective discussions of Abai and Rabbah, marking them as central figures in the development of Talmudic dialectical reasoning. Before his death, Abai received reports of severe persecution affecting Jewish communities in Judea under the rule of the Roman Emperor Constantius. Refugees fleeing these conditions brought with them new legal interpretations originating from the scholarly circle of Jochanan, a leading authority in Judea. These new teachings revitalized the intellectual energy of Babylonian scholars, creating renewed engagement with legal study and interpretation. Abai died relatively young in the year 338 of the Common Era. After his death, leadership of the Pumbeditha Academy was transferred to Rabbi Bar Joseph Bar Chama of Machuza, born in 399 and died in 352 of the Common Era. His appointment occurred without dispute, as though it was widely accepted that he was the natural successor. Rabba was a man of considerable wealth, intellectual sharpness, and analytical ability. However, he was also aware of his personal limitations and often reflected on his own character. He expressed that he had wished for three qualities: the learning of Huna, the wealth of Chasta, and the modest character of Rabba Bar Huna. According to his own admission, he succeeded in acquiring the first two, but not the third. Rabba's personality reflected certain characteristics associated with the inhabitants of Machuza, a city whose population largely descended from converts to Judaism. Because of this background, many established Babylonian Jewish families tended to avoid marriage alliances with them. Rabba, however, developed a strong desire to gain acceptance from the people of Machuza. In his role as a judge, he feared losing their support, yet he also prided himself on being impartial. He observed that if a judge becomes too popular, it is often not due to moral excellence, but because he avoids confronting wrongdoing directly. In contrast, Abai had criticized such tendencies, arguing that a teacher of religious law who is universally liked may be failing in his duty if that popularity is gained through leniency and avoidance of necessary moral correction. Within Machuza, tensions also arose around issues of social status and lineage. Some scholars, including Zaira II, issued legal interpretations regarding marriage eligibility among certain groups, particularly descendants of converts and individuals of uncertain lineage. These rulings provoked strong reactions within the community, at times leading to public hostility. In one instance, during the Festival of Tabernacles, when temporary booths were traditionally decorated with fruits, Zaira faced such intense opposition that he was nearly attacked by members of the community, reflecting the volatility of social tensions surrounding legal decisions. Rabba later responded by challenging Zaira's interpretation, arguing in favor of broader marital acceptance, including even alliances involving priestly families. This position gained him favor among the people of Machuza, who expressed their approval through gifts and public support. Over time, however, Rabba revised some of his earlier rulings, possibly in response to criticism from other scholarly circles. He clarified that while certain unions were permissible, communities retained the freedom to follow stricter standards if they chose. Another controversy in Rabba's life involved financial conduct. Despite his wealth, he was at times associated with a tendency toward financial caution bordering on greed. A notable case involved a convert from Machuza who had deposited a large sum of money with Rabba for safekeeping, intended for his son who was studying religious law. When the depositor fell ill, Rabba considered retaining the funds on the legal basis that, according to rabbinic interpretation, a convert's inheritance rights were limited and certain family claims were not recognized under the legal framework. At a decisive moment in the intellectual leadership of the Babylonian academies, the principal authority of the schools, deeply versed in the intricate system of Jewish legal tradition, confronted a dispute involving a wealthy man named Isor and the disposition of his property in favor of his son. Isor desired to transfer his fortune to his son. However, the leading legal authority of the academy sought to invalidate this transfer, considering it inconsistent with established legal principles governing inheritance and testamentary action. In the midst of this tension, another scholar, equally trained in the complexities of the law, offered a subtle legal suggestion to Isor. He explained that while a formal written transfer might not be valid, Isor could still declare before witnesses that the property already belonged to his son, thereby bypassing the legal restriction through oral affirmation. This alternative interpretation provoked strong anger from Rabba, the leading Babylonian scholar of the Academy of Pumbeditha, a major center of Jewish legal study in Babylonia. Rabba viewed this council as a serious breach of legal integrity. He reacted as though he had been deprived of a rightful legal claim, treating the matter not as a technical disagreement, but as a distortion of justice itself. His reaction, however, stood in tension with an established principle within halacha, the system of Jewish legal interpretation. That principle addressed cases in which property entrusted by a non-Jew to a Jewish custodian had not been otherwise disposed of by its original owner. Even when legal obligation did not strictly require returning such property to certain categories of heirs, the moral expectation of fairness still demanded ethical consideration. Thus, Rabba's strict position appeared inconsistent with the broader ethical framework of the tradition he himself represented. Further examples of Rabba's approach reveal a pattern of behavior that drew criticism from later interpreters. In managing agricultural property, he imposed higher rents on tenants than what was commonly accepted across Babylonia. This placed additional financial pressure on those of modest means, creating a contrast between his judicial reputation and his practical economic conduct. Even more controversial was the behavior associated with his brother, Soram, who exercised authority over poorer members of the community in a highly coercive manner. Soram assumed the role of a moral enforcer, evaluating the religious conduct of individuals of lower economic standing. Those he deemed insufficiently observant were subjected to forced labor and compelled to serve him, including being transported in ornate and elevated conveyances. Although this behavior was severe, Rabba did not openly oppose it. Instead, he attempted to justify it by referencing an ancient legal interpretation that had once allowed certain forms of servitude under conditions of religious deviation, even though such interpretations were no longer broadly accepted in practice. Over time, the social environment within Babylonian Jewish society began to change significantly. The earlier simplicity and communal equality that had characterized Jewish life in Babylonia gave way to increasing social stratification. Wealth, status, and scholarly recognition began to merge into a single privileged class. Many scholars adopted refined clothing, lived in elevated material conditions, and were transported with public display of honor. This created a visible separation between the scholarly elite and the general population. Rabba himself acknowledged, in reflective moments, that his judicial decisions were influenced by subconscious partiality. He admitted that when cases involved individuals of his own scholarly class, he struggled internally until he could interpret the law in a way favorable to them. This revealed the emergence of an internal tension between legal objectivity and social affiliation. Institutional privileges also developed during this period. Members of the scholarly class were granted economic and legal advantages, including preferential treatment in marketplaces, priority in legal hearings, and exemptions from certain communal taxes when their communities fulfilled collective obligations. In some cases, scholars were even permitted to declare their status in foreign regions to benefit from these privileges, a practice that marked a significant departure from earlier generations, when scholars avoided any personal benefit from their intellectual authority. This transformation provoked growing resentment among the general population. Ordinary people began referring to scholars with a tone of criticism, using expressions that implied distance and disapproval. This linguistic shift reflected a deeper social fracture, as scholarly authority became associated in public perception with self-interest rather than communal service. Opposition to the scholarly class became particularly visible through individuals such as members of the family of Benjamin of Mechuza, a physician whose household held considerable influence in the region of Mechuza, a prominent Jewish city in Babylonia. This group questioned the practical value of scholarly study, arguing that despite complex legal reasoning, scholars were unable to resolve basic contradictions in everyday life. They expressed skepticism toward the usefulness of dialectical interpretation, suggesting that it failed to engage with practical realities. Although these criticisms were labeled as doctrinally problematic by Rabba, they did not result in formal exclusion, likely due to the social standing of those involved. Despite these tensions, intellectual activity within the Academy of Mechuza continued to expand. Students gathered in increasing numbers around Rabba's teaching, often prioritizing study over economic responsibilities. This led Rabbah to issue a cautionary instruction, advising that students should not attend during critical agricultural seasons, such as spring and autumn, when farming and production of essential goods required attention. This warning reflected concern that excessive devotion to study could disrupt the economic stability of the community. Rabbah's teaching style was widely regarded as intellectually powerful. His method emphasized clarity of explanation, precise distinction between legal concepts, and bold analytical interpretation of traditional material. He preferred dissecting the legal structure of the Mishnah, the foundational compilation of oral law, rather than merely memorizing its content. This analytical approach transformed legal study into a structured system of reasoning, elevating it beyond transmission into an active interpretive discipline. Rabbah, the leading scholar of the Academy of Pumbeditha in Babylonia, developed a bold and far-reaching principle that reshaped the way Jewish legal tradition was understood. He declared that the later interpreters of the Mishnah, known as the Amoraim, stood intellectually above the earlier teachers known as the Tanaim. The Amoraim, in his view, did not merely repeat the teachings of the Mishnah, but explained them more deeply and resolve their hidden difficulties. To express this idea, Rabbah used a striking comparison. He would say that a single grain of pepper, representing sharp intellectual insight, was more valuable than an entire basket full of melons, representing bulk without precision. In this way, he emphasized that intellectual acuity was more important than simple accumulation of material knowledge. This position placed him in contrast with Zira I, another Babylonian scholar who rejected excessive argumentative reasoning. Zira valued the Mishnah in its simple and direct form and feared that overly complex interpretation would distort its original meaning. Rabbah, however, defended analytical expansion. He interpreted a verse from Ecclesiastes, chapter 10, verse 9, saying that those who merely know the Mishnah without deeper reasoning resemble someone who breaks stones and harms himself through useless effort. In contrast, those who engage in Talmudic reasoning resemble someone who splits wood and gains warmth, meaning that intellectual effort produces meaningful benefit. This distinction became the foundation of what later came to be known as the Talmudic method. A powerful intellectual triumvirate emerged during this period, consisting of Rabbah, Abai, and Rabbah's colleagues. These scholars were not merely transmitters of tradition, but dialecticians who built legal reasoning through structured debate. In this sense, the intellectual foundation of the Babylonian Talmud was shaped primarily in these academies, while the Jewish schools of the land of Israel remained less engaged in this form of analytical development. Because of his vast knowledge, intellectual depth, and possibly also his financial influence, Rabbah became the central authority of his academy. His rulings were respected widely, and even communities in the land of Israel sent questions to him for clarification. This was especially significant during a time when the Jewish population in the land of Israel suffered repeated persecutions under Roman rulers such as Constantius and Gallus, leading to widespread instability and intellectual decline there. At the same time, the Jews living under the Persian Empire also faced serious difficulties. The city of Machuza, an important Jewish center in Babylonia, was occupied by a Persian military garrison. The local population, which was largely Jewish, was forced to support the stationed army, creating economic strain and social tension. The Persian monarch Shapur II, ruler of the Sasanian Empire, was not particularly favorable toward the Jewish population. In earlier periods, large numbers of Jewish families had been relocated to Armenia, where they established communities. Now Shapur II forcibly deported a large population, estimated at 71,000 individuals, resettling them in regions such as Susiana and the city of Ispahan. Ispahan, an ancient capital of Persia, became so heavily populated by these exiled Jews that it acquired the name Jehudia, meaning Jewish place. The policies of Shapur also affected Babylonian Jewry directly. Rabbah was forced to spend significant personal resources in order to prevent further persecution of his community. Despite his high status, He lived under constant political pressure. His associates once praised him for having avoided major disasters that had struck other Jewish communities. But Rabbah responded with hidden concern, stating that they did not know how much effort he was required to exert in secret to manage relations with the Persian court. At one point, Rabbah faced a direct personal crisis. As head of the academy, he had ordered the corporal punishment of a Jewish man who had engaged in illicit relations with a Persian woman. The punishment resulted in the death of the offender. When this incident reached the attention of Shapur II, the king ordered that Rabbah himself be punished for exercising judicial authority without imperial approval. Rabbah managed to escape by fleeing, but his house was looted and destroyed. Further consequences were prevented through the intervention of Ifra Ormuzd, the queen mother of the Persian Empire. She advised her son that he should not interfere with the Jews, claiming that their prayers were answered by their God. Unlike the king, she maintained a consistently favorable attitude toward the Jewish community and often protected them from harsher measures. On one occasion, she sent Rabbah a gift of 400 gold coins. Another scholar, Rami, argued that such gifts from non-Jewish authorities should be rejected according to religious principles. However, Rabbah accepted the money and redistributed it to needy non-Jewish poor, thereby avoiding personal benefit while still using the resources for charity. In another instance, the queen mother sent an animal to the academy in Mechuza, requesting that it be sacrificed according to Jewish ritual law as a sign of respect toward the God of Israel. This unusual gesture reflected the complex relationship between Persian authority and Jewish religious life during this period. Rabbah did not live long enough to witness later developments, such as the formalization of the Jewish calendar system introduced by Hillel II, nor did he see the brief period of relative stability that followed. He died after 14 years of leadership, leaving behind an intellectual tradition that had permanently transformed the structure of Jewish legal reasoning. During the generation that followed the passing of Rabbah bar Joseph bar Chama of Mechuza, a major turning point unfolded in the intellectual landscape of Babylonia, the great Jewish center situated between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers under Persian rule. The city of Mechuza, once intellectually vibrant under Rabbah's leadership, began to lose its prominence. In contrast, the Academy of Pumbeditha, one of the principal Babylonian schools of Talmudic learning, gradually returned to a leading position after having yielded influence during Rabbah's lifetime. Yet this transition marked not a surge of brilliance, but rather a noticeable decline in creative strength, as if the earlier intellectual intensity had exhausted itself. Within this era, no successor fully matched the stature of Rabbah, the master of dialectical reasoning whose analytical system had shaped generations of legal discussion. Instead, the leading figures of Babylonia, Nachman ben Isaac, Papa, and Chama of Nehardea, held authority more by circumstance than by transformative intellectual power. The distinctive method of the Pumbeditha school, known for sharp analysis and intricate argumentation in interpreting Jewish law, continued to exist, but it no longer advanced in originality or depth. Nachman ben Isaac, born approximately in the year 280 and dying in the year 356, was appointed head of the Pumbeditha Academy, formerly known as the Matibta, primarily due to his advanced age, recognized piety, and perceived independence of judgment. His leadership lasted only 4 years and did not produce any significant doctrinal development or lasting reforms. During this same period, a new center of learning emerged near Sora, at a place called Neres, situated along the canal bearing the same name. This new academy was founded by Papa bar Channon, born around the year 300 and died in 375. Papa, who had been orphaned at an early age, acquired wealth through the brewing and commercial production of date-based beer, a common industry in Babylonia. Together with his close associate and business partner, Hunab ben Joshua, he attempted to establish a new intellectual center. Although both men were respected and financially stable, they were unable to fill the intellectual void left by the death of Rabbah. Students from Mechuza eventually gathered around them, yet comparisons between the new leadership and the earlier masters consistently revealed a decline in scholarly depth. Several episodes illustrate Papa's position within this weakened intellectual environment. On one occasion, younger scholars traveled to Nares to attend his lectures. However, his presentation of the material lacked clarity, causing confusion among the audience. Observing their silent communication and uncertainty, Papa expressed deep embarrassment and dismissed them, instructing them to leave in peace. On another occasion, Samai ben Ashi, father of the later renowned scholar Ashi, posed questions that exceeded Papa's analytical capacity. Overwhelmed and fearing public humiliation, Papa resorted to prayer, asking for relief from the distress caused by intellectual pressure. Witnessing this reaction, Samai chose thereafter to refrain from further questioning. Papa's interpretive method in matters of halacha, the Jewish legal system derived from the Mishnah and expanded through rabbinic discussion, reflected a lack of decisiveness. When confronted with conflicting legal opinions, instead of resolving disputes through critical distinction, he often advised accepting both positions simultaneously, even when logically incompatible. This approach reflected the intellectual hesitation of the period rather than methodological innovation. Papa held his position for 19 years, from 355 to 375, yet the intellectual stagnation of the Babylonian academies persisted until after his death. Another figure of this period, Chama of Nehardea, served as a leading authority in Pumbeditha. His intellectual limitations are illustrated through an interaction with Shapur, the king of Persia, also known in historical sources as King Shaba. The king questioned whether the Jewish practice of burying the dead was based on divine law or merely customary tradition, noting that Persian society neither buried nor cremated the dead in the same manner. Chama was unable to cite a scriptural basis for burial. This omission was later criticized by Acha ben Jacob, a member of the household of the exilarch, the political leader of Babylonian Jewry, who remarked that clearer textual evidence existed within the Torah itself, specifically the commandment requiring burial on the same day of death. Chama held his position for approximately 21 years, from 356 to 377, a period during which broader geopolitical changes in the Roman Empire significantly affected Jewish communities in both Palestine and Babylonia. A major development occurred with the rise of Julian, nephew of the Roman Emperor Constantius. Julian's ascension represented a temporary but highly significant reversal in imperial religious policy. Julian, later known in Christian historical tradition as Julian the Apostate, was a complex and influential ruler whose intellectual formation was shaped by teachers such as Libanius, a prominent rhetorician, and Maximus, a philosopher associated with Neoplatonism. Although born into the Christian imperial family of Constantine, Julian was compelled to outwardly adhere to Christianity during his early life due to political pressure and fear of assassination within the ruling dynasty. After being elevated unexpectedly to co-emperor status by Constantius, and later becoming sole emperor following a military uprising and the sudden death of Constantius, Julian assumed full control of the Roman Empire. Once in power, he openly rejected Christianity and sought to restore elements of traditional Greco-Roman religious life while reforming its most criticized aspects. Julian's policy direction included protection of oppressed communities, reduction of excessive taxation, revival of philosophical education, and restoration of pre-Christian religious traditions in a modified and reformed form. At the same time, he attempted to restrict the expansion of Christianity, which had rapidly gained dominance within the empire over a relatively short period. The Emperor Julian, a ruler shaped by a complex intellectual and religious background, approached the question of religious authority with a distinctive perspective that set him apart from previous Roman emperors. Having been raised within Christianity, he later developed a critical stance toward it, while simultaneously forming a renewed interest in the traditions of Judaism, which he encountered through the study of the Hebrew scriptures known as the Holy Bible. Despite experiencing persecution earlier in life, Julian did not respond to Christian communities with the same methods of repression that had been used against others in the past. Instead, he chose to restrain their influence through intellectual opposition and administrative limitation. In civil governance and scholarly environments, he worked to reduce their authority and to challenge their ideological dominance through reasoned argument and rhetorical critique rather than physical punishment. Within this intellectual confrontation, Julian referred to Jesus of Nazareth as a Galilean figure whose followers, in his interpretation, had elevated him through belief into divine status. He extended this designation to Christians as a group, using the term Galileans to emphasize their regional and historical origin rather than their theological claims. His language was deliberately crafted to diminish their authority in philosophical and cultural discourse. At the same time, Julian expressed a markedly favorable attitude toward the Jewish people, distinguishing himself from most Roman rulers since the time of Alexander Severus, a 3rd-century Roman emperor who had also shown limited interest in Jewish tradition. Julian's preference was shaped by several factors. His exposure to the Hebrew Scriptures introduced him to the concept of a singular and supreme deity, which he referred to as the great God of the Jewish tradition. However, he did not accept the exclusive monotheistic claim that no other divine forces existed alongside this deity, maintaining instead a broader philosophical view that allowed for multiple divine powers. He also expressed admiration for the social structure of Jewish communities, particularly their system of charitable support. He observed with approval that Jewish society appeared to care for its poor in such an organized manner that extreme poverty, as seen in other parts of the empire, was largely absent. This impression contributed to his respect for their communal discipline and ethical organization. In addition to intellectual admiration, Julian was motivated by political strategy. By showing preference for the Jewish population, he sought to weaken the ideological confidence of Christianity, which often defined its own superiority in contrast to Judaism. His policies, therefore, carried both philosophical and political objectives. Julian also displayed interest in the ancient sacrificial system described in Jewish tradition, particularly the temple rituals once performed in Jerusalem. He criticized Christianity for abandoning sacrificial worship, arguing that it had removed an essential element of ancient religious practice. Although the Jewish temple no longer existed at that time, and sacrificial worship had ceased, he regarded its historical structure as an important model of organized religious expression. During his brief reign, lasting from November of the year 361 to June of the year 363, Julian implemented a series of measures that significantly improved the condition of Jewish communities within the Roman Empire. He reduced oppressive taxation, removed legal humiliations associated with accusations of blasphemy, and addressed earlier injustices that had accumulated under previous administrations. He maintained direct communication with Jewish leadership, including the Patriarch Hillel, whom he addressed with formal respect and referred to as a venerable friend. Through written correspondence, he expressed his intention to correct the wrongs suffered by the Jewish population. He also extended official communication to Jewish communities across the empire, signaling a broader imperial policy of reconciliation. Among his most significant intentions was the plan to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, a city that had been transformed under earlier Christian emperors into a predominantly Christian urban center. This reconstruction project was framed as both a restoration of historical heritage and a political gesture of goodwill. In one of his formal imperial communications addressed to Jewish communities, Julian described the burden of previous taxation systems that had been imposed without proper notice and that had required excessive financial contributions. He claimed to have personally examined administrative records and identified measures that he considered unjust. He ordered the cancellation of certain tax obligations and the destruction of official records associated with what he viewed as discriminatory financial practices. He further stated that earlier policies had been influenced by administrative corruption and ideological hostility rather than fair governance. In response, he emphasized his decision to eliminate these practices and prevent their occurrence. Julian also addressed the system of communal obligations imposed on Jewish populations, including specific forms of tribute and compulsory contributions. He instructed that these burdens be discontinued, declaring that Jewish communities should be allowed to live without fear of financial exploitation. His goal, as expressed in his correspondence, was to ensure stability and allow religious communities to exist in a state of security within the empire. He further connected this condition of security with his broader political ambitions, suggesting that a peaceful and stable population would be more capable of offering prayers for the well-being of the empire. In his reasoning, internal tranquility within subject communities contributed to the strength of imperial governance. Finally, Julian expressed his intention, upon the successful conclusion of his military campaign against the Persian Empire, to visit Jerusalem personally. He declared that he intended to support the reconstruction of the city and participate in its restoration, presenting this act as a culmination of both imperial policy and religious reconciliation. A remarkable message was sent in this period from the Roman Emperor Julian, a ruler of the Roman Empire known for his attempt to restore ancient pagan traditions. Although he was deeply engaged in preparing a large military campaign against the Persian Empire, he issued a proclamation that reached the Jewish communities with unusual favor and sympathy. This letter was received as something unexpected after long years of hardship under previous rulers, almost like a moment of relief after prolonged difficulty. Later Jewish tradition even compared it to earlier royal decrees of Cyrus the Great, the ancient Persian king who had once allowed Jewish exiles to return to their homeland. In Jewish interpretation of prophetic texts, a verse from the book of Daniel, chapter 11, verse 34, was applied to this moment. The verse speaks of a time when a fallen people would receive a little help. According to this interpretation, the prophet Daniel was understood to have foretold that after severe suffering under the Roman Emperor Gallus, the Jewish people would receive assistance from Julian, who would show favor and even express support for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, the central sacred structure of ancient Jewish worship that had been destroyed nearly 3 centuries earlier. Julian, known for his interest in ancient religions and opposition to the dominance of Christianity within the Roman Empire, did not abandon this promise. Despite being fully occupied with the organization of a major military campaign against the Persian Empire, he gave serious attention to the idea of restoring the temple in Jerusalem. For this purpose, he appointed a trusted administrator named Alypius of Antioch, a respected intellectual and close companion of the emperor. Alypius was instructed to supervise the entire project and was given authority to use any necessary financial or material resources. The Roman governors of the provinces of Syria and Palestine, regions located in the eastern part of the empire, were ordered to cooperate fully with Alypius. Materials for construction were prepared in advance, and large groups of laborers were assembled. Their task was to clear the accumulated ruins that had covered the temple site since its destruction by the Roman general Titus, approximately 300 years earlier. Despite the scale of this imperial initiative, Jewish sources remain almost completely silent about active participation by the Jewish population itself. Later Christian writers claimed that Jews from distant communities sent donations and that individuals even contributed personal valuables. But these accounts are not supported by early Jewish records and are generally considered later interpretations rather than historical reports. The Roman administration under Julian had already provided the necessary resources and workforce, making such contributions unnecessary. At the same time, Christian writers of the period circulated opposing claims. Some asserted that Julian's favorable attitude toward the Jews was a political strategy intended to draw them away from their traditional faith and toward pagan practices. Others accused Jews of attacking Christian communities in various regions of the land of Israel and neighboring territories, although these reports are inconsistent and difficult to verify. A more credible account records that in the city of Edessa, an important center in the region of Mesopotamia, Christian groups carried out a violent attack against the local Jewish population, resulting in significant loss of life. As construction began in the spring of the year 363 of the Common Era, expectations and tensions increased. However, the process soon encountered serious obstacles. During the clearing of the ruins and excavation of the foundations, sudden fires erupted beneath the site. These incidents caused the deaths of several laborers and created fear among the workforce. Modern explanation suggests that these fires may have originated from gases trapped in underground spaces beneath the ancient temple complex. When these gases were exposed during excavation, they ignited upon contact with open air, producing sudden and repeated explosions. These unexpected events led to the gradual abandonment of the construction effort by many workers. Had there been strong and sustained participation from the Jewish population itself, it is possible that such obstacles would not have halted the project so easily. However, the absence of widespread engagement weakened the initiative. Ali Pius, observing the repeated disruptions and lack of momentum, eventually awaited further instructions from the emperor rather than continuing active reconstruction. Some later accounts claim that Julian accused Christians of deliberately causing the explosions and even threatened to use the ruins of the temple as punishment against them upon his return from the Persian campaign. However, these versions originate mainly from Christian sources written after the events and are widely regarded as unreliable. Christian writers of later generations also developed elaborate narratives describing miraculous events that allegedly occurred during the attempted rebuilding. These stories were intended to demonstrate divine opposition to the reconstruction and to affirm the supremacy of Christian belief over earlier religious traditions. In the broader historical context, the Persian campaign undertaken by Julian ended in failure. Julian, who had sought to challenge the power of Shapur II, emperor of the Sasanian Persian Empire, found himself deeply engaged in a vast military confrontation between two major world powers, the Roman Empire representing the Western world and the Persian Empire representing the Eastern world. The conflict took place largely in the region of Babylonia, an area with a significant Jewish population that had long been influenced by both empires. At this time, it is not clearly recorded how the Jewish communities aligned themselves politically, as the sources provide no unified or definitive account of their position during the struggle. The fortified town of Firas Shaba, a settlement in the region influenced by the Euphrates River canals and known to contain a significant Jewish population living under foreign imperial rule, was subjected to a determined siege lasting 3 consecutive days. The attacking Roman military forces eventually compelled the town to surrender. After capitulation, the settlement was set on fire, leading to its destruction as a place of habitation and local administration. During the chaos of this military collapse, many of its inhabitants escaped using small boats that moved through the canal networks connected to the Euphrates River system. Because of this forced evacuation, historical reports do not preserve a clear judgment on the political alignment of the Jewish population of Firas Shaba during the reign of the Roman Emperor Julian. In contrast, the nearby settlement of Bitra, more accurately identified in historical sources as Bertha, presents a different outcome. This town was inhabited exclusively by Jewish residents and was encircled by a relatively low defensive wall. When confronted by Roman military pressure, the population abandoned the settlement entirely before the final phase of the assault. Once the city was left empty of its inhabitants, Roman soldiers entered and, driven by the intensity of wartime aggression, burned it completely to the ground. Another key location in this sequence of military campaigns was Machuza, also known in Persian administrative language as Malgam Malka, a settlement positioned close to the imperial center of Ctesiphon, the capital region of the Sasanian Persian Empire. Machuza functioned partially as a suburban extension of that capital and contained a Persian military garrison responsible for its defense. The Roman forces launched a particularly intense siege against this location. The resistance was so strong and prolonged that even the full strength of the Roman army was barely sufficient to bring about its capture. Machuza also held intellectual importance, as it had been the seat of the academy associated with the Jewish scholar Rabbah, a leading authority among the Babylonian Amoraim, the group of interpreters and legal analysts of the Mishnaic tradition. The Jewish population of Machuza was known for its wealth and confidence, and it was often described as rivaling the splendor of the Persian capital itself. Despite this prominence, the city was eventually destroyed in the broader conflicts of the Roman-Persian War and fell approximately 10 years after the death of Rabbah, around the year 363 of the Common Era, when Roman siege engines broke its defenses and reduced it to ruins. In later periods, the city was rebuilt, reflecting the recurring cycle of destruction and restoration in the region. Although Emperor Julian advanced deeply into enemy territory during this campaign against the Persian Empire, he ultimately failed to reach Ctesiphon itself, the central objective of his military expedition. His campaign ended not in decisive victory, but in sudden reversal. Julian died as a result of a battlefield wound inflicted by an arrow, which some accounts attribute to a soldier within his own forces who had adopted Christian beliefs. His death occurred near the Tigris River in June of the year 363. Ancient accounts describe his final moments as composed and philosophical in tone, consistent with his education in classical Greek thought. Shortly before dying, he is reported to have acknowledged the triumph of his adversary in a symbolic statement directed toward the Christian faith, which he referred to as Galilean belief. The death of Emperor Julian near the Tigris River marked a turning point for the Jewish communities living under Roman authority. Julian had been perceived as a rare imperial figure whose policies were comparatively favorable toward Jewish life, particularly in contrast to earlier emperors such as Constantine and Constantius, whose legislation had imposed restrictions and pressures. After Julian's death, these early restrictive laws were not immediately reactivated, and his previously established policies continued to operate in areas not directly connected to Jewish privileges. His successor, Emperor Jovian, who ruled from June of the year 363 until February of the year 364, inherited a weakened imperial position and was forced to negotiate a disadvantageous peace agreement with the victorious Persian ruler Shapur. His short reign did not allow time for significant policy changes. Jovian adopted a position of general religious tolerance within the empire, allowing subjects to identify with different religious traditions without suffering direct political penalties. Following this brief reign, imperial authority was divided between two rulers, Valentinian I, who governed the Western Roman Empire from the year 364 to 375, and Valens, who ruled the Eastern Roman Empire from the year 364 to 378. Valens, who followed the theological position known as Arian Christianity, had previously experienced political pressure from dominant Catholic factions and therefore adopted a comparatively tolerant stance. Under his rule, Jewish communities were granted protection and even received certain honors and administrative recognitions within the eastern provinces. Valentinian I, ruling the Western territories, also adopted a policy of religious tolerance during the ongoing conflict between competing Christian doctrinal groups, particularly between Catholic and Arian factions. His administration permitted individuals to follow their chosen religious traditions without losing civil or political standing. This general policy of tolerance extended, as a matter of imperial practice, to Jewish communities across his domains, allowing them to maintain their religious identity within the broader structure of the Roman state.